The north is cold and full of whispers.
The slave bells no longer rang at midnight. Daenerys had silenced them in the first week after Meereen fell, one of the quiet decisions that mattered more than the loud ones. For 2 centuries those bells had divided the night for the enslaved, measuring hours and shifts and punishments, carving the dark into portions that belonged to someone else. Now they were silent, and the nights in Meereen belonged to whoever had the will to use them. She had not truly slept in 3 days. She stood on the high terrace of the Great Pyramid, with bare feet on warm stone, looking out over the bay. The water was the particular black of depth before dawn. The city was quieter than it ever became in daylight, not silent, because Meereen was never silent, but still enough that she could hear, far below her, the sound of Drogon sleeping. It was not quite a snore, and not quite the settling of the earth. Something between the two, the sound of something enormous at rest. She had been dreaming of 3 shadows and a sun that could not find the right sky to rise in. She heard no footsteps. There were never footsteps. Quaithe stood at the railing. The mask was lacquered wood painted in stars. Beneath it nothing Daenerys could ever read. The voice that came from behind it was unhurried, even, as though the woman existed entirely outside the ordinary passage of time, and found urgency a mild curiosity. "The shadow you carry is not your shadow alone," Quaithe said. "The dragon does not have 1 head, nor 2. The son of fire and ice walks in black, in the cold, behind a wall of stone and ancient magic. You cannot go west until you face east. You cannot find your throne until you find your blood." Daenerys opened her mouth. The terrace was empty. She stared at the space where the woman had been. She had learned after Qarth not to waste time on that staring. Had learned that the mystic's truths were designed to become true in the person who received them, not to be explained in advance. She had learned this. She was not comfortable with it. She went inside before the sun came up. She did not sleep. He arrived before the sky was fully light, carried between 2 unsullied in the manner of men who are not quite dead yet, but are approaching the matter seriously. He had been found in the alley outside the pyramid's eastern servants' gate. 3 wounds, 1 through the shoulder, 1 in the right side that had bled in quantity. 1 crossing his forearm in the particular way of a blade turned at the last moment by bone. The brands on his neck and wrists were old, faded, the markings of a Giscari household. A former slave, now free, now dying on a pallet in her solar, while a maester catalogued his damages. He had asked for the queen. He had been asking since the patrol found him. Not a servant, not a steward, the queen, specifically, with the desperate insistence of a man who knows he has 1 task remaining and intends to complete it before his body makes the decision for him. He said only one thing about why: the man who sees the board. Sir Barristan Selmy arrived in her solar in full armor, which told her he had not been sleeping either, or had learned to dress himself faster than any man alive. He was courteous and quiet with the guards, quiet with the maester, and then very still when the phrase was reported to him. "Clear the room," Daenerys said. When the door closed, Barristan looked at her. His expression had the quality of a man finding a phrase recognizable from a very specific occasion. Varys used that phrasing once, in King's Landing, for intelligence he needed the small council to act on immediately. Whether he invented it for that occasion or used it as a standing signal, I cannot say with certainty. But its meaning was unmistakable. Not a piece moved on the board. The board itself changed. He paused. Whatever is in that man's boot concerns something of that magnitude. The object was sewn into the heel of the dying man's right boot, not wrapped, not tucked, but actually sewn in with careful, deliberate stitching that spoke of someone who expected the body to be searched. A cylinder of Myrish glass, the hardened kind, the kind merchants used to send documents across open water. Inside, 3 sheets of parchment, tightly rolled, smelling faintly of a seal that had been present and was now gone. Daenerys broke it herself. The first document was brief. The handwriting was spidery and small and rigorously controlled, not a single unnecessary mark, and Barristan confirmed it in 4 words: "That is his hand." It said the bearer was trusted. The intelligence was verified through independent sources. and the reader should understand this to be the most consequential document she would ever hold. She read the second document. A sworn testament from a septon named Maynard, taken down in the year before Robert's rebellion. A private ceremony. A tower in Dorne. A northern woman, young, dark-haired, gray-eyed, named in the document as Lyanna of House Stark. A prince, named without abbreviation, Crown Prince Rhaegar of House Targaryen. A marriage. Witnessed, the third document was a citadel notation. A maester's entry, bureaucratic and precise and annihilating. An annulment, Rhaegar Targaryen's marriage to Elia of Dorne dissolved, dated 6 weeks before the ceremony in the tower. She read all 3 documents. Read them again. Set them on the table and looked at them for a long time. "Tell me what you knew," she said. Barristan sat without invitation. She did not correct it. He placed his hands flat on the table and seemed to be looking at something in the middle distance that only he could see. "I knew he loved her," he said. "Not what I might have preferred to believe, what I saw. At Harrenhal, the great tourney, the year the false spring came, he rode past Princess Elia with the victor's crown in his hand. Past his own wife. 10,000 people watching. He put the crown on Lyanna Stark's head. Blue winter roses. Stark colors." He stopped. He did not look like a man doing something wrong. That was what I could never make peace with. He looked like a man carrying out a sentence that had been passed on him before he was born. And the marriage. The child. I did not know. I suspected he felt more than admiration. I did not suspect this. He looked at the documents on the table. He read until his candles burned to stubs. He played the harp in the barracks when he thought the corridors were empty and grown men. Men who had killed without blinking, would stop walking and not move until he finished. He was melancholy. Not unhappy exactly, aware always of what things cost. A pause. He became a knight because a prophecy required it. He read the passage in the Citadel library at 12 years old, and came out changed. He told me the next morning, "The dragon must have 3 heads. He said it the way you say something you have known all your life and have only just been given the words for." 3 heads, Daenerys said quietly. Aegon and Rhaenys, by Princess Elia. And a 3rd child who had to exist. The 3rd rider. He believed it the way maesters believe in evidence, systematically through proof. He pursued the conclusion. Barristan looked at her directly. Ned Stark's bastard is not Ned Stark's bastard. Under every reading of succession law, his claim is senior to yours. By blood, by birth, by every custom Westeros has ever held. He is alive. He wears black at the wall, in the cold, behind the oldest structure in the world. And he does not know. He did not look away. Rhaegar built 3 heads, Your Grace. I spent 15 years believing 2 of them were buried in the ruins of King's Landing. I was wrong. Daenerys stood at the window. The bay was gold now, fully lit, the morning committed to itself. She could hear Drogon below, the low, resonant shift of a mountain deciding to wake, and somewhere in the city the first bells of a new day rang on no one else's schedule. She had 3 dragons. An army. A city she had not yet learned to hold, and a throne she had not yet learned to take. What she had never had, not since the tent in the Dothraki Sea where Drogo died and everything familiar went with him, was blood. A house that was more than one woman carrying a dead dynasty's name alone into the world. She turned from the window. "Prepare a ship," she said. "Fast. Small crew. Something that can move." Barristan was already on his feet. "You will go yourself. There is no one at that wall who will believe this from a stranger, and we cannot afford disbelief. You have the face they will recognize, Rhaegar's Kingsguard, Robert's Kingsguard, the man who was present for all of it." She let a beat pass. "Find him. Tell him what he is. And bring him home." Barristan's fist went to his chest. The old Kingsguard salute, the one she had never seen him make for anyone. Not in all the time she had known him. "Your Grace." He left. His footsteps faded down the stairwell. Below, Drogon's waking sound became something fuller. a long exhalation that moved through the stone of the pyramid like a tide. She went back to the high terrace alone. She held the glass tube in both hands and looked west, toward the horizon she could not yet reach. The wall was 700 feet of ancient ice, and it had its own weather. Not the weather above it or around it, but its own. A permanent cold that exhaled from the surface in vapors that tasted of iron and old stone, and something beneath both that Jon had never been able to name, only recognize. After 3 years in its shadow, he had learned to read it. He was not certain the wall had moods in the way a person did, but the distinction was academic. The effect was the same. He woke that morning before dawn as he always did, in the Lord Commander's chambers, on a cot he had not yet replaced with something that fit the title. The chambers smelled of Mormont's pipe wax and old maps, and the cold that got into Castle Black's stone from the inside. He lay on his back for 4 counted breaths, then stood. 6 weeks since the battle. 6 weeks since the wildlings came over the top of the wall and through the tunnel below it, and he had spent an entire night killing men he had eaten beside, argued with, understood. 6 weeks since Pip had taken an arrow in the throat and died with his eyes open. 6 weeks since Gren had held the tunnel against a giant, until neither the giant nor Gren was standing anymore. 6 weeks since Ygritte had walked through the gates of Castle Black with fire behind her and an arrow in her bow, and had looked at him across the chaos of dying men, and had chosen not to use it. And then had been shot herself by someone who didn't know or didn't care about the difference. He had held her while she died. She had asked him if they were still at the cave, and he had said yes, and she had seemed satisfied with that, and then she was gone. He dressed in the dark and went out to the yard. The Lord Commander's burden was not the title, which fit awkwardly at 20 years old and probably always would. It was the specific burden of knowing that the Watch had elected him because the battle had exposed every weakness in the organization's upper tier, and that half the men who voted for him had done so because they could not think of anyone else, and that Alliser Thorne, who had received the second highest vote count, would spend every remaining day of his life turning that ambiguity into something he could use. Today, apparently, was one of those days. Thorne had arranged the drill without warning, which was the first signal. 15 minutes notice before assembly, no briefing on parameters, 5 men assigned to Jon's command with a smirk that the yard could read from 20 feet. 20 men in the attacking force, well-rested, briefed, ready. The exercise was simple in its statement: defend the inner gate. 5 men against 20 at a choke point. The standard doctrine was plain: hold the gate, use the structure, let the architecture do the work that numbers couldn't. Every man in the yard knew this. The exercise was designed for Jon to execute standard doctrine, be overwhelmed, and give Thorne the demonstration he had been building toward since the election: the Lord Commander is a boy who does not know what he is doing. Jon looked at the 5 men assigned to him, looked at the gate, looked at Thorne standing to the left with his arms folded and his face arranged into something that was not quite a smile, because Thorne had better discipline than to allow himself that satisfaction in advance. Then Jon looked at the east postern. He kept his voice low. 12 words to his 5 men. 3 with me. 2 hold the gate. He pointed the 2 smallest men at the gate. They looked uncertain, which was correct. He took the other 3 and moved. Not to the gate, around it. The east postern was a door cut into the outer wall 20 yards right, used by builders for wall base access. Unguarded in the drill's scenario because it had been forgotten, which made it the only thing that mattered. They went through the postern, around the building's back edge, through a covered walkway where the cold was compressed between stone walls, and their breath came out in hard white bursts. Out the other side, behind Thorne's 20. Behind them, moving toward a gate with 2 uncertain defenders, and not yet aware of anything behind them. Jon hit them from the rear with 3 men, and the 2 gate defenders hit them from the front when the shouting reached them, and they stopped being uncertain immediately. The drill resolved in under 4 minutes into a technical Castle Black victory. Thorne looked at him across the yard. The not quite a smile was gone. In its place was the specific stillness of a man performing arithmetic and finding the result worse than anticipated. Jon helped pull his 5 men up from the dirt. He did not speak. He walked back to the Lord Commander's chambers and washed his hands in water that had developed a thin skin of ice across the top. He cracked it with his knuckles. He thought about Gren. He did that most mornings. The dreams had started 3 weeks ago. They arrived in the hour before false dawn, the specific window when the wall's breathing changed, and the ice above seemed to settle with a sound registered in the chest rather than the ears. In that window, Jon dreamed. Not the gray, formless cold he had become accustomed to, the dreams that tasted of old smoke and left him more exhausted than waking. These were different. Bright, wrong in a specific way that was not unpleasant, which troubled him more than nightmares would have. He saw fire from above. Not the wild, uncontrolled burning of an accident, but deliberate, precise fire, falling in sheets from something that breathed it. He was moving at a height no person could occupy. At a speed that made the air against his face not air any longer, but pure pressure. Beneath him, in the heat-heavy light of a southern afternoon, gold and blue pyramids spread across the landscape like something arranged by a dreaming god. A woman stood in a courtyard, silver-haired, not old. Her face was tilted upward in the way of someone accustomed to watching the sky for something that would come. She was not afraid. He saw dragons, not dead things, not the ancient enemy. Living things. Things that moved the air with their movement through it, that cast shadows across whole city blocks, that were, and this was the part he could not have said aloud to anyone in Castle Black, his to call. That was the specific sensation in the dream, the absolute understanding, the way you understand your own hands, that they would come if he asked. He woke every time with Ghost watching him. The direwolf was always in the same position when Jon surfaced, sitting between Jon and the door, upright, the size of a calf but solid as stone. Red eyes catching the corridor torchlight with the unblinking attention Ghost reserved for threats and for Jon. Not interchangeable categories, related ones. A young crow named Edric, 15, still in the period of being amazed by everything before the wall stripped it out of him, asked Jon the following morning while they cleaned practice blades in the armory, "Is it true about the dragons in the east?" Jon looked at him without expression. "Someone said there's a queen with 3 of them, that one of them burned a whole fleet." "I know nothing about dragons," Jon said. The dream came again that night, the city of gold pyramids, the woman in the courtyard, the shadow of something vast and warm moving above him through the air. He woke before the wall's false dawn, sat up in the dark, and did not attempt sleep again. He climbed to the top of the wall alone in the hour before the afternoon watch rotation. Because there was nowhere at Castle Black better suited to thinking than 500 feet of wind and silence, and a horizon that had no opinion about anything. The view north never changed. Endless forest, endless white. The silence of a landscape that did not register the existence of anything beneath a certain scale. The sky above was the gray-blue of old iron, uniform, without variation. The wind came from the north the way it always came, carrying nothing except cold and the complete absence of news. He thought of Ned Stark. He thought of him most days. He thought of Robb, gone at the twins, gone in a way that Jon still could not hold all at once, that he took in small amounts, because the full weight was too much for any single moment. He thought of Pip's laugh, which had always seemed too loud for the barracks, and was now absent in a way that made the barracks too quiet. He thought of Gren holding a tunnel against a giant, which was the most Gren thing Gren had ever done. He looked north and thought about his name, Snow, not Storm, which they gave the bastards of the Stormlands, not flowers, or sand, or stone. Snow, the name of the cold, of nothing, of boys placed in the world with no true name to carry through it. He had worn it for 20 years. It had never sat comfortably. He had always assumed the discomfort was his, a personal failing, an inability to accept the shape of the life he had been given. Standing at the top of the world in the wind, he was no longer certain the discomfort had been his. Ghost pressed against his leg. The direwolf's warmth was the only warm thing on the surface of the wall, and Jon did not move away from it. Below, somewhere on the castle grounds, a raven called once and went quiet. Neither of them said anything. Not yet. 7 weeks of open water showed on the hull. The salt crust was thick enough that the wood beneath was no longer visible in places, and the crew moved with the specific economy of men who had been at sea long enough that unnecessary motion, felt like a personal insult. But the banner on the mast had not been touched. Black field, three-headed dragon in red, snapping in the shivering sea wind with the crisp authority of a thing that had been recently replaced, and deliberately so. Sir Dennis, the garrison commander at Eastwatch, a broad-built man of 60 with the particular leathering of someone who had spent decades standing between weather and duty, watched the ship through a long glass from the eastern battlements. He called his 28 remaining brothers to arms without raising his voice. His brothers knew that meant it was serious. Daenerys did not lower his voice for things that weren't. The envoy's request came in formal High Valyrian, translated by a Meereenese freedwoman who had accompanied the party for exactly this purpose. It was addressed not to the garrison, but through it, to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jon Snow, by name, and then one additional phrase that Dennis had the girl repeat 3 times before he was satisfied he had heard it correctly. "We request audience with Jon Snow of House Stark, nephew to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen of House Targaryen." The garrison went very quiet. Dennis sent the Raven to Castle Black himself. Barristan Selmy walked through the Eastwatch gate, and the 28 brothers arranged themselves without deciding to, not in a line of welcome, not in a line of defense, but in the indefinite middle position of men who were not certain which was appropriate and had resolved to manage both simultaneously. The 8 Unsullied who followed him did not help with the uncertainty. No one at Eastwatch had seen Unsullied. The brothers knew the name. They knew most names of things that might eventually come for them, but the name had not prepared them for the reality of 8 men who moved with no wasted motion whatsoever, who occupied their exact footprint in the world and no more, whose spears were held at identical angles without any evident coordination between them. One of the builders, a young man from the Reach who had taken the Black 3 months prior and had not yet learned to govern his reactions, stepped backward 1 full pace before he caught himself. Barristan allowed the brothers their looking. He was courteous with Daenerys, careful to present the party as guests under the Watch's hospitality rather than anything more demanding. When they asked, and they asked, because a man of his face and reputation traveling with Unsullied under a Targaryen banner created questions that had to go somewhere, he answered each one with the same polished, unhurried finality. "I am here to speak with Jon Snow. All other matters can wait for that conversation." The Dothraki blood rider named Aggo said nothing to anyone. He looked at the wall for the entire 3-day road south to Castle Black, and his expression did not change once, which was its own kind of statement about the wall. Jon was waiting in the Lord Commander's chambers when they arrived. He had been told a galley was in Eastwatch Harbor. He had been told a knight of the old Kingsguard had sailed from Essos asking for him by name. He had not been told anything else, because no one else knew anything else. He stood when Barristan entered the room. He did not consciously decide to stand. He stood the way you stand when the room changes. The man was old, not in the way of men who had gone to fat or ruin, but in the way of something reduced to its essential components by long weathering. The silver hair was close-cropped. The gray eyes were direct in the manner of eyes that had spent a lifetime looking at difficult things without adjusting their focus, and had decided the habit was permanent. He was tall, still straight, carrying himself with the posture of a man for whom the spine was not merely structural, but a daily statement of principle. Jon knew the name. Ned had spoken it, not often, but with the particular weight he gave to men whose quality was not in question even when their choices were. Sir Barristan Selmy, Lord Commander of Robert's Kingsguard, the greatest knight of his generation, or the one before it. A man who had fought on the wrong side of Robert's rebellion and been kept on afterward, because Robert had the wit to recognize excellence even when it had tried to kill him. "Sit," Jon said. The word came out more abruptly than intended. Barristan sat. He did not begin with the conclusion. Jon would understand later that Barristan had rehearsed this conversation for 7 weeks of open water and had decided, deliberately, to approach it from the ground up. He told Jon about Rhaegar Targaryen. Not the version that everyone at the wall knew. Not the prince who stole Lyanna Stark, triggered a war, and collected what he deserved at the Trident when Robert's warhammer found his chest. Barristan's version was slower and more specific. A boy who locked himself in a library at 12 years old and emerged with a purpose he had not applied for. A man who could play the harp in the late hours and make soldiers in corridors forget where they were going. A knight of extraordinary quality, who was always slightly uncomfortable with his own quality, because it had been handed to him by prophecy, and he was not certain he had earned it through any effort of his own. He was melancholy, Barristan said, not unhappy, melancholy, aware, at all times, of the weight of things. He read every account he could find of the long night, of the last hero, of the prince that was promised. A pause. He came out of the library one morning and told me the dragon must have 3 heads. He was 12 years old. He had the expression of a man who has been given a task he has not chosen, and intends to complete it regardless, with complete thoroughness, because that is the only way he knows to do anything. Jon's hands were flat on the table. He rode past Princess Elia at Harrenhal, Barristan continued. In front of 10,000 witnesses, he placed the victor's crown on your mother's head. Blue winter roses, the Stark color. He met Jon's eyes. He did not look like a man doing something wrong. "What is this?" Jon said. Barristan placed the glass tube on the table. Jon did not reach for it. Barristan opened it himself and laid all 3 sheets of parchment flat, smoothing each one with the methodical care of a man who understood that the gesture mattered as much as the document. He pointed to the Septon's testament and read the relevant passage aloud, not loudly, in the flat, deliberate voice of someone delivering a fact that requires no emphasis to be devastating. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Lyanna of House Stark. A private ceremony in a tower in Dorne. Witnessed, lawful under the gods and under Westerosi law. No, Jon said. The 3rd document confirms an annulment of Rhaegar's prior marriage to Princess Elia of Dorne, dissolved before this ceremony was performed. Everything was in order. Everything was legal. Barristan's voice remained level. Lord Eddard Stark was your uncle. Lyanna Stark was your mother and his sister. He swore to protect your life with his own honor, and he kept that oath for 17 years, at a cost you have been living inside without knowing it. Ned Stark was my father. Ned Stark loved you as one. That is not the same thing. Jon stood. The chair scraped back against stone. He crossed to the window and put his back to the room, looking at the wall through the small square of glass, 700 feet of ice sitting in its own cold vapor, unchanged, indifferent to everything happening inside the building below it. "I don't know why you're here," Jon said, "or what you think this." "Queen Daenerys Targaryen sends her greetings," Barristan said. "She asks that you come home." The room was very still. "Don't," Jon said. Barristan rose. He stood for a moment, not gathering himself, because he had never needed to gather himself, but making a deliberate choice about what came next. Then he said 2 words. Quietly, without particular inflection. 2 words into the still air of the room, carrying the weight of 40 years of saying them to the only people in the world who warranted them. "Your Grace." Jon turned. "Don't call me that. I have said those words to 2 kings. Barristan held his gaze without blinking. "Aerys Targaryen, who deserved them less than any man who has ever drawn breath. Robert Baratheon, who took them by conquest and wore them like borrowed armor for 17 years. A pause. "You are the 3rd. You will either carry that name into something worth building, or the long night will come for it when it arrives, and there will be nothing left of the House of the Dragon at all. I have not sailed 6 weeks across open water to be told no by a man in a black cloak who does not yet know what he is." Jon looked at him for a long time. "I need to speak with Maester Aemon," he said. Aemon was in his chair by the small fire, his ancient hands folded in his lap, his milky eyes directed at a point that was not the stone wall in front of him. He was not asleep. He was simply operating at a depth slightly removed from the room's surface, the way very old men sometimes did, not absent but unreachable by ordinary noise. Jon closed the door. He told Aemon everything. Not quickly, and not with embellishment, in the order it had happened, watching the old man's face for a reaction that might tell him how to calibrate his own. Aemon listened from beginning to end without speaking, without moving, with the particular quality of stillness that was not passive but active, the listening of someone who already knows the shape of the story and is waiting to hear how the specific words land. When Jon finished, The fire made its small sounds. Then Aemon said, "I know." Jon said nothing. "The dragon dreams you described to me 3 months ago. You did not know they were unusual because you had nothing to measure them against. I did." The old voice was even, unhurried, the bond with Ghost, deeper than warg sense, different in quality, as if the animal recognizes something in you that you have not recognized in yourself, and the way you move in a crisis. He paused. Not like a bastard, never like a bastard, like a man who was told to be small and never entirely believed it. He reached out. His hand found Jon's face without searching, the precision of a man who has mapped the world through touch across many decades of failing sight. He pressed his palm once to Jon's cheek, briefly, the way an old man touches the face of someone going somewhere he cannot follow. "I gave up the throne because I was not what it needed. The watch needed me, and I gave the watch everything, and I have no regrets about that." He lowered his hand. "But you are what the throne needs, and you are also what the dead will require when they come, the thing that is both, that carries ice and fire in the same blood, that cannot be one without the other." A long breath. Go find your blood. Come back and save what is left of us." Jon looked at the old man's face in the firelight. The oldest living Targaryen, sitting in a cold room at the edge of the world, smelling of candle wax and age. There was nothing sufficient to say. He left without saying it. Word traveled in Castle Black the way fire moved through dry timber, not gradually, not with warning, but in the sudden total way of something that had been waiting for the right condition. By the morning after Barristan's arrival, every brother in the castle knew 3 things. A Targaryen galley was in Eastwatch Harbor. A knight of the old Kingsguard had sailed from Essos to find Jon Snow. And that knight had used a specific form of address that the garrison brothers who had relayed the raven had not been able to resist including in their telling. The word nephew moved through Castle Black like a charge of current through wet stone. The reactions ran their full range. Disbelief, the dominant flavor, the flavor of men whose daily existence was cold stone and black wool and a duty they had accepted in the place of every other kind of life. Amusement, in a few cases, and in a smaller, more dangerous cluster, the men closest to Alysir Thorne, something that was not amusement and not disbelief. Something that moved quickly from hearing the news to calculating what it meant and arriving at a conclusion. Thorne called his emergency gathering of officers before the morning meal was served. Jon heard about the gathering before it concluded. He dressed and went to find Sam. Sam Tarly was in the library, which was where Sam always was when the castle was managing a crisis without his involvement. Sam was not calm. Sam was never precisely calm, but he was functional, and he was already working through the problem before Jon had finished telling him what Thorne's gathering had decided. "Confinement pending formal hearing," Sam said, "with the Lord Commander as the subject. He cannot legally confine you. You are the authority. What he's describing is a mutiny, dressed as procedure." "I know what it is," Jon said. Outside the library window, he could see the yard beginning to fill. Thorne's men were already in position. Positioned, not patrolling. There was a difference Jon had learned to read at 10 years old in Winterfell's training yard. These men's feet said they were waiting for a specific thing. He found Barristan in the corridor, kept his voice below the level that carried. "How quickly can you move 8 unsullied to the gate?" "Already done," Barristan said. Jon looked at him. "I assumed," Barristan said. They went to the yard. Thorne was waiting by the well with his men, and the specific expression of a man who is prepared for a confrontation and intends to manage it efficiently. He was not alone. The noise of the morning had drawn most of the castle's active bodies into the yard's periphery, ranging from curious to hostile to the quietly attentive cluster near the forge that contained Dolorous Ed, who had placed himself within earshot without making it obvious he had done so deliberately. Ed was one of 2 who remained. 6 weeks ago, by the time the battle's toll had been counted, the names Pip and Gren had been added to the list that Jon carried in the part of himself he tried not to open very often. He carried it anyway. "Jon Snow," Thorne said. He did not say it loudly. He had the professional's understanding that control of volume was control of register. "You will come with us." Jon stopped 6 feet from him. He did not reach for his sword. He had already decided not to reach for his sword, had decided it in the library with Sam, because the moment a blade came out, the entire nature of the situation changed in ways that had no good conclusions. He addressed the Yard, not Thorne, not his men. The Yard, the full audience that had assembled because Castle Black was a small place where large events drew all available bodies. "Sir Alliser wants to confine the Lord Commander," Jon said. His voice was level, conversational, pitched to carry without effort. "I want to point out 3 things." Thorne's expression tightened. He had prepared for resistance. He had not prepared for a speech. "First," Jon said, "confining a seated Lord Commander on the grounds that he may be receiving foreign intelligence is not a legal proceeding. It is a mutiny. The brothers in this yard should be clear on what they are being asked to participate in." Sam, who had followed Jon into the yard and positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, opened his mouth and began talking very quickly about historical Night's Watch precedent. Jon let him go. Every second Sam was talking was a second Thorne had to divide his attention. "Second," Jon continued, "a galley flying Targaryen colors is sitting in Eastwatch Harbor. Whatever you believe about what that means, it is a political fact that the Watch's leadership should be communicating with, not suppressing. The Watch's founding principle is that we stand apart from the politics of the realm. Preventing the Lord Commander from investigating a foreign envoy is a political act. Someone in this yard should be asking why Sir Alliser is so eager to prevent that investigation." Thorne said, "Take him." His men moved. Ghost moved first. The dire wolf was simply there, between Thorne's men and Jon, without hurry, without any display of aggression whatsoever. No snarl, no lowered head. A dire wolf the size of a calf with a shoulder at a grown man's hip, standing in the yard, looking at the men in front of him with red eyes that registered them with the absolute, specific attention of something that has already solved the problem and is waiting to see if the problem requires solving. The men's feet stopped. "Third," Jon said, "I am going to walk to the gate. Anyone who wants to debate the legality of that after I've gone can send a raven. I will read it on the ship." He walked to the gate. The walk across the yard had the quality of something very slow happening very quickly. Jon did not run. He walked with his eyes forward and his hands away from his sides, the gait of a man communicating through his body that everything happening right now is completely unremarkable. Behind him, Ghost padded alongside. Behind Ghost, Barristan fell into step. Ed Tollett appeared at Jon's right side from somewhere in the crowd's edge. Sam appeared at his left, still talking about legal precedent to anyone within hearing range. 3 brothers stepped in front of the gate. Ghost reached them first. The 3 brothers stepped aside before they had consciously decided to, in the way that the body sometimes acts without consulting the mind when presented with certain specific categories of information. Through the gate. South, the road from Castle Black to Eastwatch ran south of the wall along the eastern edge of the gift. 3 days at a hard march, they moved faster than merchants, slower than cavalry, stopping only when the horses needed water and the men needed not to collapse. Barristan set the pace without discussion. The Unsullied maintained it without complaint. Ghost ranged ahead in the dark and returned without reporting anything, which was the best news available. On the second night, in a stand of birch trees where the road narrowed between 2 low ridges, they found the road blocked. 8 men in Bolton livery. The flayed man on their cloaks was visible in the moonlight. Dreadfort men, a small scouting party positioned with the deliberate placement of soldiers who had been told to be in this specific location rather than soldiers who had happened to arrive there. Jon stopped. He looked at the road, looked at the wood's edge, looked at Barristan, who had drawn no weapon and showed no reaction, and at Aggo, who had his hand on his Iraq's grip in the loose, ready way of a man who was not yet committing but had made the necessary preparations. Jon turned to Barristan and said quietly, "Can you hold the road for 3 minutes?" "Yes." "Then hold it." He took Ghost, Aggo, Ed, and himself into the tree line to the east, moving fast and low through the birch trunks. The Bolton party's attention was on the road, on Barristan and the 8 Unsullied, standing in plain sight with the particular stillness of men who have decided to be very visible and are comfortable with that decision. Ghost circled. Not at Jon's signal, not from any command, from his own reading of the situation, which Jon had stopped finding surprising some time ago. The direwolf moved through the trees in near silence and emerged on the Bolton party's south side. Behind them. Between them and any road that went anywhere useful. 8 Bolton soldiers looked north at 8 Unsullied, then looked south at a direwolf, then looked at each other with the specific expression of men updating a calculation and not enjoying the result. They moved off the road. Nobody spoke. They reached Eastwatch on the 3rd morning, as the sun came over the shivering sea and turned the water from black to deep gray to the cold blue of deep winter. The garrison commander opened the harbor gate without a formal order or a formal request, in the way that certain decisions make themselves when a man of good judgment finds himself standing between a direwolf and the open sea. Jon stopped at the end of the pier. Sam was beside him. Sam's face was doing the thing it did when he was applying everything he had to not doing something his face wanted to do. "The Citadel," Jon said. "There's research," Sam started. "There are records, there are things that need to be found. The White Walkers, Dragonglass, the Long Night, there's a Maester's archive that nobody's properly read in." Sam stopped. "Read everything," Jon said. "Find anything. Send ravens." Sam nodded. He could not quite make his eyes meet Jon's, which Jon understood, because some things were easier when you were not looking at them directly. Jon gripped his shoulder once. Sam's hand came up and gripped back, briefly, with the fierce economy of someone rationing the gesture. Then, Jon walked down the pier and boarded the ship. He went to the stern as Eastwatch fell behind them, as the harbor mouth opened into the gray immensity of the shivering sea. Castle Black's torches were visible for longer than seemed reasonable, small fixed points of light in the northern dark, holding on. Ghost stood at the rail beside him. The direwolf looked north, toward the wall, toward what was beyond it, with the fixed attention of something memorizing a thing it would need to carry a long distance. Neither of them looked away until the lights were gone. The coast of Slaver's Bay arrived first as a shimmer, a disturbance on the southern horizon that Jon initially dismissed as heat haze until Barristan appeared at his shoulder and said nothing, which was Barristan's way of indicating that what Jon was looking at was real and worth his full attention. Then, the pyramids resolved out of the shimmer. Gold and blue and bronze, stepped and enormous, rising above the waterline as the ship drove south with a wind that had been consistently generous for the past week. The scale of them was wrong. Not wrong, but beyond preparation. He had known they were large. Barristan had described them, the sailors had described them. He had tried to build something in his visual imagination that might approximate the reality. The knowing and the seeing were completely separate things. They rose above the city's lower structures the way the wall rose above Castle Black, not as a building at its peak, but as the logic of the landscape, the thing everything else organized itself around. The light was different too. Heavier, more interested in its own brightness. The northern light Jon had lived his entire life inside was honest about what it was, present, functional, without pretension. This light was doing something else, making the gold faces of the pyramids more gold than gold had a right to be, making the harbor water a blue that had no equivalent in any northern sea. Then, he heard them before he saw them. A sound that existed at the edge of a cry and a roar without being either, something that lived in the space between categories. 3 shapes wheeled above the tallest pyramid, banking in wide circles on thermals. Their shadows swept the harbor water in slow, sweeping passes that Jon's suddenly hypersensitive attention tracked before he understood why he was tracking them. One descended, green and bronze, catching the afternoon light on scales that seemed to absorb and redirect it rather than simply reflect it. It descended from the pyramid's heights in a long, controlled spiral, and as the ship entered the bay's outer waters it leveled and began to circle. Once, then again. The crew did not panic. They had sailed with Daenerys long enough to know the dragons as constants, but they moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had learned to perform their duties while keeping something very large in their peripheral vision. Jon stood at the prow and did not move. Rhaegar circled the ship at 50 meters, at mast height. His head was the size of a horse's body. His wingbeats displaced air that Jon could feel on his face at this distance. Not wind exactly, pressure, as if the atmosphere had opinions about the dragon's passage through it. His eyes, when they found Jon at the prow, were amber and split-pupilled and old, in a way that had no relation to calendar years. They held that regard for the length of the second circle. Then Rhaegar climbed back to the heights above the pyramid, and the ship moved into the harbor. Jon did not breathe normally for several minutes after. In the throne room above the city, Daenerys had known the ship was in the harbor for an hour before it docked. Missandei had brought the information with the specific, careful neutrality she used for developments that required Daenerys to calibrate her reaction rather than simply have one. 4 months. She had spent 4 months thinking about what Jon Snow's existence meant, had gone around the full circuit of it, the political implications, the succession question, the sudden clarification of a prophecy she had been unable to resolve, the personal geometry of meeting someone who was family in a way she had never had family, which was to say, real, blood, undeniable. She had thought about it until she had thought through it, and arrived most mornings at something closer to readiness than she had expected to feel. She would receive him in full court. The decision had been made and remade through the same reasoning each time. A private meeting was a private meeting, with only her word and his as testimony to whatever passed between them. A throne room with witnesses and the full political weight of her position on display, that was a document. It was also, and this was the part her advisors had not been told, a test. She wanted to see who this man was before she decided what to do about the fact of him. Grey Worm stood at the dais steps in full armor, presenting nothing. His posture said what his face refused to. This man should demonstrate something worth trusting before being trusted with anything. Daario Naharis had said that morning, with the lounging ease of a man who found formal occasions tedious, that every man who arrived in Meereen eventually wanted to be king, and that this one simply had a better argument for it than most. She had not answered him. The absence was answer enough. Missandei stood at her right hand and watched the doors. Jon entered in Night's Watch black. The color was wrong for the room. The room was gold and blue, and the colors of heat and wealth and southern certainty. He wore the black of the cold, of the wall, of an oath he had left behind without fully understanding what he was walking toward. He did not belong here. This was visible to everyone present, and Jon knew it, and the knowing made him stand straighter. A thing she noticed from the dais before he had crossed a quarter of the floor. She had been told he was her age. She had not fully reckoned with what that meant until she saw him. She had expected someone marked by loss the way she was marked by it, the particular bearing of a person who has been through fire. He was marked. But differently. He carried loss inward rather than forward. It sat behind his eyes rather than in his posture. He was very still, moving through the court with the economy of a man who had spent years making himself unobtrusive, and had only recently been told that was no longer necessary. She was evaluating him. She felt him evaluating her with equal attention, carefully, without making it obvious. This she respected. He stopped at the correct distance from the dais. He did not bow, not from defiance. She could read the difference between defiance and absence, and this was absence. He simply had not been taught the correct gesture for this specific situation, and was not prepared to perform one he had not earned the meaning of. "You know, I am Daenerys Stormborn, of House Targaryen," she said. Her voice carried the room without effort. The first of her name, Queen of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons, rightful heir to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms. She held his gaze. "And you are?" "Jon Snow," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Level, without performance. "Late of the Night's Watch. Not Jon Targaryen?" A pause. "Not Aegon? I was raised a Snow. I've been a crow. I don't know what I am." The court was very quiet. She let it stay that way for one measured beat. "Then I will tell you," she said. "You are Rhaegar's son. That makes you my nephew." She did not look away from him. "It also makes your claim to the Iron Throne senior to mine under every succession law the Seven Kingdoms have ever held." The room moved without moving. The collective reorientation of 50 people processing a sentence their queen had just spoken aloud, in open court, in front of witnesses, without any visible hesitation. It was not a slip. She watched him understand it was not a slip. She had handed him the most powerful instrument in the world, and was watching whether he reached for it. He held her gaze across the full width of the throne room. "I have no interest in the Iron Throne, Your Grace." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, and she was not performing this, it was genuine in a way that surprised her by being genuine. "That is precisely what someone who deserves it would say." Something moved in his face. Not a smile. Something adjacent to one, arriving and departing quickly as if it had not been given permission. The formal audience concluded shortly after. There would be dinner, and then the conversation that mattered, the private one where the actual terms of whatever this was would be negotiated by the two people who had to live inside it. But that was later. For now, the formal thing was done, and an unsullied escort led Jon Snow from the throne room toward the quarters she had prepared in the pyramid's lower residential wing. The outer courtyard of the Great Pyramid was wide and open to the sky, paved in the old Giscari pattern of interlocking triangles worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet. The afternoon heat down here was a different thing than it was at the heights. Lower, closer, more personal, the kind that didn't move when you moved through it. Jon heard the wings before he saw what made them. Rhaegar landed in the courtyard. Not beyond the walls, not at the safe distance of a creature that had chosen to observe from a considered remove. In the courtyard itself, 30 feet ahead of Jon's path, folding wings with a sound like enormous sails collapsing all at once, leathery and final and absolute. He settled his weight with a motion that was controlled, but not delicate, the way very large things settle when they are at ease in a space, and turned his head to regard Jon with one amber eye at close range. The unsullied escort's spears came up in unison. Jon raised one hand slowly, palm out, without looking at them. He stood still. Rhaegar's eye tracked over him with an attention that had no animal referent Jon could locate in 20 years of living around horses and dogs and a direwolf. Not the attention of something deciding whether to eat, not the nervous assessment of something that has sensed a threat, something else, something that was reading him in a register he couldn't identify. Processing information he was not aware he was transmitting. He thought of Ghost. The way Ghost had sat between him and the door in the Lord Commander's chambers every night the dreams came. The way Ghost looked at threats and at Jon, not interchangeable categories but related ones. 30 feet of courtyard heat between them. The city's noise beyond the walls. Nothing else. Then, Rhaegar lowered his head, not to the ground. A dip, deliberate, measured, the gesture of a creature that has made a decision about what it is looking at, and is communicating that decision without ambiguity. From the upper balcony of the pyramid, Daenerys watched. She had seen Rhaegar fly, had seen him hunt, had seen him destroy things of considerable size with complete efficiency. She had never seen him offer that gesture to anyone. She had never seen him stand still in anyone's presence with that quality of stillness, the stillness of something that has recognized what it is looking at and no longer needs to assess it. She stood at the railing with her hands on the stone and watched Jon Snow and Rhaegar look at each other in the courtyard below. For the first time in a very long time. She had no prepared response to what she was seeing. She did not reach for one. 3 days passed in the strange, suspended quality that major events sometimes produce in their aftermath, the world continuing its ordinary business while everything that matters waits for something to resolve itself. Court proceeded. Meals were served. The Unsullied drilled in the lower yard. The Sons of the Harpy killed a freedman on the eastern docks and left the gold mask as signature. Meereen was, in all visible respects, exactly as it had been before the ship arrived. But the courtyard had happened. The dragon had dipped its head to a stranger in black northern clothing, and in a city where Daenerys Targaryen's dragons were the central fact of political life. The reason every calculation ran through her, the reason every enemy hesitated, that event had moved through the pyramid's population the way a stone moves through still water, quietly, in all directions simultaneously. The debate was held in the small council chamber on the pyramid's 3rd level, and it was brief, because Grey Worm attended it. Dario's position was the one she had expected. The risk was disproportionate. A dead Aegon Targaryen was materially worse than no Aegon Targaryen, because a dead Aegon Targaryen became a martyr for every Targaryen loyalist in Westeros to organize around, without any of the complications of the living man. If Rhaegar killed him, and dragons had killed better-intentioned people for less, the political problem did not disappear. It compounded. Rhaegar has already recognized him, Missandei said. She stated it as information rather than argument, which was more effective than either. 3 times in the courtyard. Preventing the bond from completing at this stage is not a precaution. It is the equivalent of standing in front of a river and instructing it to change direction. The river has already decided. Grey Worm said nothing. His posture said, I assessed this man when he arrived. I have updated my assessment. I am prepared to proceed. Daenerys let the debate conclude, and then asked everyone to leave. The last advisor closed the door and the room changed, contracted slightly, became more honest. I'll offer you Viserion, she said. He is the calmest of the 3, better suited to a first. Rhaegar, Jon said. Why? A pause. Something crossed his face, the expression of a man who has arrived at a word he did not plan to use and is deciding whether to use it anyway. Because Rhaegar is named for my father. He said it simply. Then he seemed to hear what he had said, and went briefly still with the weight of it. She was briefly still too, for a different reason. All right, she said. The open basin south of the pyramid walls had been the city's great racing ground in the old Giscari era, a flat expanse of packed earth and pale gravel large enough that the pyramid itself, viewed from its center, looked like something at a considered distance. The great families had run horses here, had bet fortunes on the outcome. Now it was empty in the particular way of spaces that have outlasted their purpose, and not yet been given another one. Room for mistakes. That was the relevant quality. Daenerys called Rhaegar from the pyramid's heights with a word in High Valyrian that did not behave like a word. It resonated in the chest, rather than the ears, carried through the air and through the stone beneath Jon's boots simultaneously, and by the time the sound had finished the sky above the basin was moving. Rhaegar came down in a long descent with his wings spread, in a way that briefly blocked the afternoon sun, and landed 40 meters away in a plume of disturbed gravel that stung Jon's face at that distance. The dragon settled. He regarded Jon with amber eyes. Daenerys stepped back. She did not say, "You go to him." She did not need to. Jon had understood what this was from the moment they walked through the pyramid gates. He walked toward Rhaegar. This was not heroism in any straightforward sense. It did not feel heroic. It felt like the specific vulnerability of trusting a thing you cannot rationally justify trusting, of walking towards something that could remove you from the world without significant effort, because something wordless and anterior to reason has indicated that you should. He had trusted that kind of thing before. He had trusted it when he went under cover with the wildlings, when he walked into Mance Rayder's tent, when he stood at the top of the wall and chose not to die. It had not always been correct, but it had never been entirely wrong. He stopped 6 feet from Rhaegar's head. The dragon was breathing. He could hear it now, a rhythmic sound like bellows, slow and enormous, with a faint undertone of heat that was not yet fire but was the thing fire came from. At this range the scale of Rhaegar was not a fact but an experience. The eye nearest Jon was the size of a shield. "I don't know Valyrian," Jon said. His voice was steady. He was speaking quietly, the way you spoke to something you were trying to give time to adjust. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say to you, but your father was named Rhaegar. And my father was Rhaegar, which means we have something in common." He held the amber eye. "I've been told to trust blood. I'm trying." The dragon was still. And then Jon said something else. He did not decide to say it. 3 words arrived in his mouth in High Valyrian, words he had never studied, never heard spoken, that had no business being in the mouth of a man raised at Winterfell on common tongue and northern silence. He could not have said where they came from. They were simply present, the way a name is present in a dream before you understand you are dreaming. He said them, and the saying felt less like speech than like recognition, a door opening from the inside. Rhaegar, Ziri Isa Ziri. Dragon, he is he. A claim. An identification. Blood calling to blood in the only language blood had always known. Rhaegal's throat fire extinguished. The faint orange glow visible between the dragon's scales died. He went completely still, not the stillness of an animal that has frozen in alarm, but the stillness of something that has arrived at where it was going and stopped moving because it no longer had any reason to. Jon put his hand on Rhaegal's snout. The scales were warm, warmer than expected, not the heat of an open fire, not painful, but the pervasive warmth of something that carried fire at its center and conducted it outward through every surface, rough and smooth simultaneously, the roughness of armored material and the smoothness of something that had been refining itself for years toward a kind of perfection that had no interest in being decorative. Then the connection. For a fraction of a second that felt substantially longer, Jon saw through Rhaegal's eyes, not clearly, not like a vision. A cascade of sensation with no human frame of reference for any individual part of it. Temperature registering as color, motion as smell, the sky above as something vast and edible, the city below as patterns of warmth. Everything being simultaneously fire and meat and open air. The world from the perspective of a creature for whom height was not a direction but a preference, for whom fire was not a weapon but the primary language, for whom a man standing on packed earth with his hand on its snout was something small and warm and something else. Something being read in Jon that Jon could feel being read without understanding what was being found. He gasped and stepped back. His eyes were streaming, not from emotion, from the raw heat of the contact, the air around Rhaegal's head at this range containing a warmth that carried pressure. He looked at Daenerys. She was weeping. Silently. In the way of someone who has been constructing a defense against it for a long time and has found the construction insufficient. She was not performing it and was perhaps not fully aware it was happening. "He accepted you," she said. "Yes. He has never accepted anyone but me." Jon looked at the amber eye still fixed on him. At the creature that had dipped its head in a courtyard 3 days ago and had just opened something in his chest that he suspected was not going to close again. "He accepted me because you're here," Jon said. "We're the same blood. He can't separate us." She looked at him for a moment. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone returning to themselves. "Get on," she said. He climbed onto Rhaegal's back. There was no saddle. Barristan had told him this. Targaryens did not ride with saddles, and now the reason was visceral rather than historical. A saddle would have put him in entirely the wrong relationship with the thing beneath him. He gripped the natural ridge between the wing joints with his knees, and his hands found purchase on the scales in the way hands found purchase on anything when the alternative was falling. Rhaegal lifted. There was no preparation for this, not intellectually, not physically, not in any register available to a man who had spent 20 years with his feet on northern ground. The basin dropped away with a speed that removed every familiar sensation simultaneously. The pyramid fell away. The city opened beneath him in all directions at once, the gold and blue of it, the ancient geometry of the streets, the harbor and the bay and the slaver's sea going silver in the afternoon light. And then the sky opened above him, and it was not a ceiling anymore. It was everything. In all directions, none of them down, all of them possible. Drogon rose from somewhere to his left. Black wings enormous and absolute, catching the sun along their leading edges. Daenerys low along his neck, with the ease of someone who had long ago made peace with the absence of ground. 2 dragons. 2 riders. Above Meereen. The city below went still. Not silent. Meereen was never silent, but the particular stillness of thousands of people stopping what they were doing, because something above them had made the doing of anything else temporarily impossible. Freedmen and former masters, unsullied in their formations, children in the market streets, all of them with the same face. The face of a population watching the political mathematics of their world rewritten in real time, in the sky, without their input. Hizdar zo Lorak stood in the gathered court below the pyramid, with the posture of a man who had spent 4 months identifying Daenerys Targaryen's leverage points and vulnerabilities. He watched 2 dragons bank above his city and felt every calculation he had made become irrelevant simultaneously. Jon lost his seat on the descent. He had known this was possible. He had known it in the abstract way of knowing something for which no practical preparation exists. Rhaegar came down into the basin at an angle Jon had not anticipated with his body, and his knees lost their grip in the last 50 feet, and he grabbed the wing ridge with both hands and swung sideways and came off the dragon's back and hit the packed earth with his shoulder, and rolled and ended up on his back looking at the sky. Rhaegar stood over him, regarding him with the patient attention of a creature that has decided to make allowances for the limitations of the thing it has chosen. Jon started laughing. He could not stop. He could not have explained the laughter with any precision, whether it was the fall or the flight, or the 5 weeks of open water, or the crypts under Winterfell, or all of it arriving at once looking for an exit. He lay on his back on the warm packed earth of a Meereenese racing ground, and laughed in a way he could not remember laughing, and the not remembering was part of it. Daenerys landed Drogon beside him with the ease of long practice, and looked down at him on the ground with an expression he would not be able to fully reconstruct afterward. Not pride exactly, not warmth exactly, but something that held both and was larger than either. The expression of someone watching a thing happen that they had been working toward without being certain it would arrive. She extended her hand. He took it. She pulled him upright. "Now," Daenerys Targaryen said, "let us discuss the fleet." The Yunkish fleet had been in the Outer Bay for 3 months. It was not built for the kind of war that ended in a day. The coalition of Yunkai and their Giscari allies, the slaver cities who had watched Daenerys dismantle the centuries-old commerce of their region, and had decided that patience was a more reliable weapon than speed, had spent their gold on something designed to outlast her. A naval blockade, wide and deep, positioned far enough from the harbor mouth to stay outside the range of a dragon attacking from the city side, and close enough to strangle every trade route Meereen needed to survive. Supply ships turned back at the headland. Fishing boats were taken for their catch. The grain stores in the pyramid's lower levels had been falling since the 2nd week. And everyone in the war room understood the arithmetic of what happened when they ran out. One dragon against this configuration was the wrong instrument for the problem. Daenerys had proved it in 2 previous engagements. Each one had cost the Yunkish ships and cost her nothing physical, and neither had broken the blockade. A fleet that scatters has time to regroup. Scattered ships become a dispersed fleet again within a week, and the coalition had the gold and the patience to replace burned galleys faster than a single dragon could burn them. Their Scorpion batteries had come close twice. The second near miss had taken a scale from Drogon's left flank that still had not fully grown back. With 2 dragon riders, the arithmetic became a different problem entirely. The war room occupied the pyramid's north-facing chamber. The bay was visible through its wide stone window, the Yunkish fleet sitting on the horizon in the pre-dawn dark, as running lights, hundreds of them, strung across the outer harbor in the dense, patient pattern of a siege that had decided it had time on its side. Maps of the bay covered the table. Jon had been studying them for 2 days. He had marked the Scorpion battery positions in charcoal, triangulating from Barristan's reports and from his own observations from Rhaegar's back on the 3 flights he had managed since the first. The marks formed a clear pattern, obvious once you knew to look for it. "They've planned for 1 dragon," Jon said. He did not look up from the map. Every ship in that formation is organized around a single threat vector. The Scorpion batteries are positioned to cover a northwest approach, your angle from the pyramid. The eastern flank has 3 batteries total, all of them pointing northwest. They've left the southeast almost entirely open because a dragon attacking from the southeast would have to cross the full length of the bay at low altitude, which they've assessed as impossible given the distance from any safe launch point. He looked up. They haven't considered that there might be a second launch point. Daenerys looked at the map, then at him. "You go from the southeast, at sea skimming altitude, low enough that by the time the eastern batteries try to reacquire, I'm already past them. You rise from the pyramid at dawn, visible, expected, drawing every battery's attention northwest. They commit to defending against you. Then Rhaegar comes in from behind the formation. Both ends simultaneously," she said. "The wind is running southwest this week. Grey Worm confirmed it this morning." Jon looked at Grey Worm. "Twice." "Twice," Grey Worm confirmed. "He said it the way he said most things, with the economy of a man who had measured the word against the silence and found the silence inferior by a small, precise margin. Southwest wind means fire spreads east through the middle of their formation, Jon continued. If we ignite both ends at the same time, the ships in the center have no direction that isn't burning. The unsullied skiff boats go into the gaps while the crews are managing the fires. The goal isn't to sink every ship, it's to remove the formation as a coherent defensive unit within a single engagement window. Daario Naharis, positioned against the wall with his arms crossed, said, "He's been on a dragon for 6 days." 7, Jon said. 7 days. And your plan requires him to fly low over open water at speed, identify targets under combat conditions, and coordinate with you without any signal system between you, all while not falling off. "He won't fall," Barristan said. He said it quietly, from the corner, without moving. The room gave the statement the weight it had asked for. Daario looked at Barristan, then at Jon, then at Daenerys, who was looking at the map with the expression of someone who had already made her decision and was waiting for the conversation to finish reaching it. Grey Worm said, "We go at dawn." Nobody argued with it. The pre-dawn was the color of cold iron, the bay invisible beyond the harbor walls until the eye adjusted and found the running lights, dozens and then hundreds of them, the Yunkish fleet at anchor in the dark, showing their positions with the comfortable confidence of a force that had no reason to expect anything unusual before sunrise. Rhaegar was restless on the pyramid's launch terrace. He could smell what was coming. Jon pressed his hand briefly to the ridge of scales at the dragon's jaw. The gesture had developed naturally over 7 flights, a communication between them that had no human vocabulary but did not need one, and Rhaegar went still. Jon climbed into position and lay flat against the dragon's neck the way Barristan had showed him, making himself part of the profile rather than a rider sitting exposed above it. At sea-skimming altitude, an upright rider was a lever arm that physics would eventually use against you, low and forward, integrated into the dragon's line. Jon had practiced the position until it was automatic. Rhaegar lifted from the terrace and dropped immediately south, low, using the outer pyramid wall as cover, sweeping in a long arc that took him east and then southeast, and then out across the water beyond the harbor mouth's eastern headland. The spray hit Jon's face immediately and did not stop. At 20 feet above the water's surface, at the speed Rhaegar was traveling, the spray was not a mist. It was a sustained assault. His clothes were soaked through within the first minute. It did not matter. Nothing mattered except the formation of ships growing from a line of running lights into actual ships with actual rigging and actual scorpion batteries bolted to their fighting decks. He felt Rhaegar drawing breath. Behind the fleet, to the northwest, the first light of Drogon's fire rose into the pre-dawn sky like a sunrise in the wrong direction. The Yunkish fleet woke. Signal horns, running men, the scorpion batteries grinding on their mountings as every crew that had spent 3 months waiting for exactly this began training their weapons northwest, toward the Black Dragon and the Silver Queen descending from the pyramid height in the expected direction, the prepared direction. The only direction they had built their entire defensive formation to address. Every eye in the fleet was northwest. Rhaegar hit the rear of the formation from the southeast. His first breath caught 3 galleys in sequence, the rearmost ships, carrying Yunkish soldiers who were not sailors and had no particular relationship with fire, beyond the fact of not wanting to be in it. The fire reached the rigging of the first galley before the crew had processed what had happened. And rigging burned the way it always burned on wooden ships, completely, instantly, with the speed of something that has been waiting for this exact opportunity. The mainmast of the second galley was burning before the first had fully caught. The third was a decision Rhaegar made without Jon directing it, the dragon's instinct for formation and continuation, acting faster than conscious thought. Then, Drogon hit the front of the fleet from the northwest. The formation was on fire at both ends simultaneously. The scorpion batteries turned from northwest to southeast and back, and could not decide. Jon felt the displaced air of the first bolt before he heard it. 50 meters to his left, the specific pressure of something very fast passing through air, close enough to feel. Rhaegar veered without being asked, Banking east with a motion Jon absorbed through his knees and hands, and the second shot went wide into the water below. The wind came from the southwest the way it had come from the southwest for 6 days, and the fire in the formation's rear moved forward through the middle ships the way fire moved with wind behind it, which was to say without mercy and without delay. The unsullied skiff boats came out of the harbor shadows, in the gaps between burning hulls, 20 boats in tight formation, the unsullied pulling their oars with the mechanical precision of men performing a task they have trained for longer than the coalition has been planning this blockade. The Yunkish crews were sailors and overseers, and men who understood violence only when they held it, not when it arrived on them from multiple directions while their ship was on fire. Jon circled east, higher now, enough altitude to see the full shape of what was happening below, the burning ends of the formation, the forward advance of the fire on the southwest wind. The unsullied boats threading the gaps, the panicking crews of the middle ships trying to decide whether to fight the fire or fight the boarders, and managing to do neither properly. In the center of the formation, one ship was not burning. The coalition flagship, armored hull, reinforced fighting deck, flying the slaver's collar sigil from its mainmast. It sat in a pocket of clear water that the fire had not yet reached, protected on all sides by the outer ring of burning ships, and on its fighting deck the one Scorpion battery that had not yet fired sat manned and waiting, tracking Jon's position with the patient efficiency of a crew that had been told to save their bolt for a clear shot. He had seen this problem before. Different scale, identical principle. He circled wider, east, then northeast, making himself the most visible thing in the sky above the eastern flank. The battery followed him. It had to. He was the threat it had been built to address. He pulled Rhaegar wider still, watching the battery crew work the mounting, watching the bolt aim track him on the eastern arc. The morning sun was directly above and behind him. He held his line. The battery held its aim. Drogon came out of the sun from directly above. The flagship burned from the top down. The fleet was gone in under 2 hours. What remained, burning debris in the harbor mouth, surrendered ships with their colors struck and their crews on their knees on the decks. A column of black smoke so wide it altered the color of the sky above the city. And the silence. Not the absence of sound. Meereen was generating plenty of sound. The freed people of the city making a noise that was not quite cheering and not quite crying, and was something that lived in the register beneath both. The sound of a thing that has been held for 3 months releasing all at once. Jon dismounted from Rhaegar in the harbor clearing. Better than the first time, the dragon had begun adjusting its landing motion to accommodate the way Jon came off, and Jon had begun reading the adjustment in the last seconds of descent. It was not graceful. It was functional, which was the category that mattered. Daenerys landed Drogon 10 feet away. Smoke on her face and in her hair. Sea spray still drying on her riding clothes. She looked exactly as he felt, which was soaked and scorched and better than he had any right to feel. They stood in the harbor clearing while the crowd's sound washed over the walls around them, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. They had just done something that 2 people had not done together in a very long time, fought from the backs of dragons, in coordinated movement, each covering what the other left exposed, and the weight of that did not require commentary. On the harbor wall above them, Sir Barristan Selmy stood and watched the smoke column above the bay, and allowed himself one expression that was not the Kingsguard face he had worn for 40 years. It was not happiness exactly. Closer to relief. The specific relief of a man who had carried something a very long way and has been permitted, finally, to set it down. Rhaegar built this, he thought. He built all of it. He just did not live to see it assembled. In the clearing below, Daenerys looked at Jon. Jon looked at Daenerys. Between them, the smoke rose and the crowd's sound continued, and Meereen breathed freely for the first time in 3 months. The smoke column had dissipated. The harbor was clear. The burned debris of the Yunkish coalition fleet had been pushed to the bay's eastern shore by the prevailing current, and sat there in a long, ragged line of charred timber that smelled of salt and old fire, and the particular failure of men who had bet everything on a single formation. Meereen's problems had not been resolved. The Sons of the Harpy had killed 2 freedmen the night after the battle, while the city was still processing its own relief, a reminder that the insurgency understood the value of timing. The masters who had survived the harbor battle had not fled. They had gone underground into the city's old networks, which they knew better than Daenerys's people did, and which had never been fully mapped. The economy that had functioned on slavery had no replacement. The city was free and solvent in theory and hungry and fractious in practice, and nothing about burning a fleet at anchor had solved any of the structural problems that made Meereen ungovernable by day and dangerous by night. Daenerys's advisors wanted to leave, not flee, sail. There was a meaningful distinction, and they were careful about which word they used. The fleet was assembled. The army was ready. News had come by Raven from Westeros. Tywin Lannister was dead, killed by his own son in the Tower of the Hand, and Cersei had moved immediately to consolidate the small council under her own influence. The political window that created was not infinite. Jon did not argue against going to Westeros. He argued for going to the right part of it first. The maps were the same maps that had covered the war room table during the fleet engagement, rearranged now to show Westeros in full, the 7 kingdoms laid out from the Wall in the north to Dorne in the south, with the capital at its approximate center and the great houses marked in their seats. Jon stood at the table's northern end, which was not accidental. "Roose Bolton holds Winterfell," he said. "He is Warden of the North now, by Lannister grant, in exchange for what happened at the Twins. He holds the North through the Lord's fear of him, and through Lannister gold coming north through the neck, and for no other reason. The Northern Lords do not love him, they do not respect him. They are waiting." "For what?" Daario said. "For someone with a better claim and enough force behind it to make the claim credible." Jon looked at the map. "Robb Stark is dead. His heirs are dead or gone. But the North does not forget the Starks. The Red Wedding was not a military defeat, it was a murder at a table, which is a different thing to the North's memory. Every lord north of the neck knows what Lannister gold bought at the Twins. They are waiting for the right person to tell them what to do about it." "And you are that person," Daario said. Not mockingly, assessing, "I have the Stark name. Not Ned Stark's name, not formally, but I was raised at Winterfell. I trained alongside Northern Lords' sons. I fought at the Wall with men of the North who chose to take the Black. They know me." He looked at Daenerys. "You have 3 dragons and the largest army in Essos. What you do not have is someone who can walk into a Northern Lord's hall and be recognized as something that belongs to the history they are trying to protect. I am that." Missandei, standing at the table's edge with the specific stillness she used when she was processing information she would need later, said, "The Bolton situation alone would not be sufficient reason to change the campaign plan. King's Landing is the political center. Control the capital and the realm follows." "Under normal circumstances," Jon said. "These aren't normal circumstances." He looked around the table. "There's something else. Something I need you to understand before any campaign plan is finalized, because if you don't understand it and plan around it, it will undo everything you build." Daario's expression said, "Of course there is." "The Night's Watch exists for one reason," Jon said. "Not tradition, not ceremony. Not because the Wall is a useful military fortification. It exists because something lives beyond it that the rest of the world has been permitted to forget about for 8,000 years, and that forgetting is about to end." He held the table's attention. "The White Walkers are real. The dead they raise are real. I have seen them. I have fought whites, men killed an hour before, walking again with blue eyes. I watched a ranging party of 200 men fail to return from beyond the Wall because of what is out there. Something commands them. Something is driving them south." He paused. "And it does not care who sits on the Iron Throne." The room was quiet. Daario said, "The White Walkers have been dead for." "They were never dead," Jon said. "They were waiting." He did not raise his voice. He had learned, in 3 years of trying to convince people of this at Castle Black, that raising his voice was the worst possible approach. "The Watch has been sending ravens to the realm for years. The realm has been sending rapists and thieves back north and ignoring every word, because it is more convenient to believe in a dead threat than a living one. I am telling you, The threat is alive. It is north of the wall, and whatever is leading it north has an army that grows with every person it kills. The silence continued longer this time. Barristan spoke from the corner. He did not move when he spoke. He had a way of making his stillness itself a kind of weight. Rhaegar reacts to the north wind, he said. I noticed it the first week on the ship. The dragon pulls back from it slightly, holds its fire lower, the way an animal reacts to a smell that signals something its instincts predate its rider's capacity to understand. He let that sit. Dragons were weapons against the darkness once. Not against men, against the darkness. The dragon dreams that woke in Jon on the voyage south were not random. They were the blood recognizing what it is going to be asked to do. Daenerys was looking at the northern end of the map, not at Jon, at the line that marked the wall, and the blank expanse above it where the cartographers had written only "Here there be cold," and left the rest empty. She had hatched dragons from stone. She had walked into a funeral pyre and walked out the other side. She had learned, at considerable personal cost, that the world was larger and stranger and more hostile to comfortable assumptions than her early life had prepared her for. She had stopped using impossible as a response to things that made her uncomfortable. Tell me about the free folk, she said. The debate lasted 2 hours. Daario's case for King's Landing was not weak. It never was with Daario, because he was a man who had survived a long time by understanding where power actually lived and how to move toward it efficiently. The Iron Throne was the political center. Cersei without Tywin was a diminished Cersei. A southern landing with dragon support would end the war before the north could even mobilize. Jon's counter was patient, point by point, built the way he had learned to build arguments at Castle Black when he had needed Maester Aemon to authorize something the Watch would resist. Give the evidence, give the logic, give the conclusion, then give the reason the conclusion mattered more than the objection. The North is the largest region in Westeros. Leaving it in Bolton hands, in Lannister allied hands, meant fighting a two-front war indefinitely, because the Boltons would not surrender simply because King's Landing had fallen. The northern lords, who were already waiting, needed only a credible Stark-aligned force to declare for. The free folk who had been scattered south of the wall by Stannis Baratheon's arrival at the end of the battle season, purposeless, ungoverned, resentful of Westerosi civilization, but responsive to Jon Snow specifically, represented thousands of hardened fighters. Jon had earned something from them that no gold could purchase and no title could grant. And if the dead come while we're consolidating the north, Daario said, then we are already there with 2 dragons, Jon said, which is where we need to be. Daario looked at Daenerys. She was looking at the map, specifically at the space between Winterfell and Castle Black, the long empty stretch of northern wilderness that she had never seen and Jon had spent 3 years inside. If you take the throne first, Jon said, and he said it quietly, without the edge of someone trying to win a room, and the dead come south afterward, you will spend your reign fighting with a kingdom that never chose you. Lords who bent the knee because they had no other option will find one the moment there is a common enemy that is not you. He waited. If you take the north first, with me, with the Stark name, with the lords who remember the twins, you will have the whole north behind you when you take the throne. Not bent-knee loyalty, chosen loyalty, and they will follow you into whatever comes after that. Both of it. All of it. The room was quiet. Then Daenerys said, "Show me the north on the map." By the time the candles had burned to their lower third, the advisors had gone. Missandei last, closing the door with the soundless efficiency she applied to everything, leaving the war room to the 2 of them and the maps and the low light. A cool breeze came off the bay through the open window, rare in Meereen, even at this hour. Jon had noticed that the city had its own weather, and that it very occasionally produced something that was almost northern, a brief reminder that cold existed somewhere in the world. The terms of what they had agreed were not written down. There was no document that would have been adequate to it, and no ceremony that would have been honest. It was an understanding between 2 people who had decided to trust each other at enormous mutual risk, the specific trust of people who have run out of alternatives and found to their measured surprise that the alternative they have left is not as frightening as they had prepared for. She would sail with her full force to the north. He would lead the campaign to retake Winterfell. The Northern Lord's allegiance would follow if the campaign was conducted correctly, and he would see that it was conducted correctly, because this was the ground he knew. After Winterfell, after the North was secured, and the Lords had chosen, she would have his full support for her claim to the Iron Throne. Every resource he could bring, every relationship he had built. Everything. The succession question was present in the room the way certain things are present without being raised, both of them aware of it, neither of them touching it. It was not the conversation for tonight. They both understood this without saying so, and the understanding itself was a kind of agreement. "I have spent my entire life as the last of my family," Daenerys said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the map's northern edge. "Every decision I have made has been made by the last Targaryen. Every risk I have taken has been a risk the last Targaryen could afford to take, or couldn't. There's a particular quality to it, the way things feel when there's no one else." She paused. "I did not expect to have to relearn how to think without it." "You're not the last," Jon said. She looked at him. "You're not," he said again. Flat, quiet, the way he said things he meant without embellishment. "Not anymore." Neither of them was comfortable with the weight of what that meant. The word family had a specific history for each of them that made it difficult to hold without flinching. Hers built on loss and exile. His built on a lie that had been an act of love. Neither of them reached for it carelessly. But both of them felt it. The candles burned lower. The cool breeze from the bay continued, moving the map's loose edges slightly. Somewhere below, the city that had been suffocating for 3 months was learning what it felt like to breathe again. Outside the window, in the warm Myronese dark, 3 dragons moved above the pyramids. 3 weeks is not long enough to move an army onto ships. It is, however, long enough to discover exactly which parts of the process cannot be rushed, and which parts only appear that way. The harbor became, for those 3 weeks, the organizational center of everything. A controlled chaos that Missandei managed from a position near the harbor master's tower, with the serene efficiency of someone who had learned to hold a very large number of moving pieces in her mind simultaneously, and had decided to find this useful rather than exhausting. 8,000 Unsullied loaded cleanly, in order, without incident. Because the Unsullied did everything in order and without incident. The freed Myronese who chose to come, families, craftsmen, administrators, people who had decided that their future was attached to whatever Daenerys Targaryen was building rather than to the city she was leaving, loaded with more confusion, but also more determination. The Second Sons and the other sellsword companies Daenerys commanded, boarded with the practiced ease of men who had spent their professional lives moving between employers, and had simply decided this one was worth following somewhere permanent. The Dothraki were a separate problem. Jon spent an entire afternoon in the lower harbor with Aggo and 2 blood riders, who had been designated as the horse management authority for the crossing, attempting to convince 40 horses that a ship's hold was a reasonable place to stand for several weeks. The horses were not persuaded by this argument, and expressed their position clearly. Aggo, who feared the sea in a way that was deeply personal and had nothing to do with rational assessment, was also not persuaded that ships were reasonable, but was managing this through the specific Dothraki technique of refusing to acknowledge a fear existed while demonstrating its every symptom. The several hundred Dothraki of Drogo's remnant Khalasar who remained with Daenerys. Her blood riders, their riders, the faithful core who had stayed when the rest scattered after Drogo's death, all shared Aggo's opinion of the ocean and expressed it with similar restraint. Grey Worm watched from the dock above for approximately 10 minutes before deciding he had seen enough and returning to his own work. His face, as he left, contained something that was not quite amusement and had decided not to fully commit to being amusement, but had gone some distance in that direction. The fleet itself had grown in the weeks of preparation. The younkish ships surrendered at the harbor battle had been cleaned, re-rigged and restocked by crews who understood them. Daenerys's agents in the free cities had hired additional merchant galleys at rates that reflected the urgency of the request. A handful of Essos captains, men who had watched the harbor battle from the waterfront and had drawn their own conclusions about the wisdom of being associated with the winner, had approached Missandei before the second week was out and offered their vessels at competitive rates. The fleet that assembled in Meereen's harbor over 3 weeks was not the largest armada in the history of the Narrow Sea, but it was substantial, and it was hers. Barristan oversaw the military loading from the eastern pier. He had not said anything about going home. He did not need to. It was in the way he stood when his face was toward the western horizon. The posture of a man recovering something he had not allowed himself to want for a long time. The morning of departure, the harbor was full. Daenerys spoke from the steps of the Great Pyramid as the sun came over the eastern ridge, her voice carrying across the water in the way it always carried when she chose to let it, not loudly, but with the quality of something that did not require volume because it required only that people be willing to listen, and people were. She said that she had come to Meereen with fire and taken it. She said that this was the wrong way to give something to people, and that she had known it was the wrong way and done it regardless, because she had not yet learned the difference between freeing a city and building one. She said that what had been broken here, the specific ancient machinery of one person owning another, could not be unbroken. She had seen to that. The dragons had witnessed it. Whatever came after, that remained. She did not promise to return, because she was not certain she would. And the truest words she had ever learned were the ones that did not promise what they could not guarantee. What she could guarantee, the people who had been given their lives back would not have that gift revoked by anything she left behind. The council had names and authority. The army that remained was theirs to command. The city was free, which meant it was theirs, which meant what happened next was theirs to decide. She stopped there. Jon stood one step below and behind her, where the arrangement had placed him. Visible, committed, not taking space she had not given him. The freed people of Meereen who had assembled in the harbor watched Daenerys Targaryen with the faces of people watching someone they believed in leave, which was a particular kind of grief that had nothing shameful in it. They watched Jon Snow with a different face. Word had moved through the city in the weeks since the harbor battle. The man who rode the green dragon. Rhaegar's son. A Stark. The cold of the north and the old fire carried in the same blood. They did not know what to make of him entirely, and he did not know what to make of being looked at this way, not as a bastard and not yet as a king, but as something the world had not had a name for until recently, and was still working out how to hold. He did not look away from them. Aboard the flagship, in the hour before the tide committed them to the bay's mouth and then the open sea, Daenerys sent for him. The room she received him in was not the war room and not the solar. It was a smaller space, a cabin at the ship's midsection, and it contained a wooden chest that 2 Meereenese smiths had delivered to the harbor that morning, and which she had been waiting to give him since the second week of preparations. She opened it herself. The armor inside was black articulated steel, crafted by the best metalworkers in a city that had been producing fine metalwork for 3,000 years. The surface was not smooth. It was textured in a pattern that caught the light and redistributed it in ways that plain steel did not. A pattern worked into the material at the forge that suggested scales without replicating them. The suggestion was enough. It was better than replication would have been. At the left shoulder, a direwolf's head, gray metal, inlaid with pale stone eyes that were almost white. The Stark wolf, rendered with the specific quality of something that had been studied and then interpreted rather than merely copied, the smith had understood what the wolf meant and had made something that conveyed it. At the breast, over the heart, a 3-headed dragon in deep red enamel on the black steel. Not decorative. Present, the way a thing is present when it is the reason for all the other decisions. Jon lifted the breastplate from the chest. It was heavier than it looked and lighter than it should have been, the weight distributed through the articulation in the way of armor made by someone who had thought about what the wearer would need to do while wearing it. He put it on. He had worn black his whole life. The black of the Night's Watch, which was the black of anonymity, of self-erasure, of becoming a function rather than a person, of snow, which was what they named boys who weren't supposed to be anything. This black was different. It was the black of a decision made and stated, of both names carried at once without apology or explanation. Barristan, who had been standing near the cabin door in the way he stood near doors when he was present, but not intruding, looked at the completed picture for a long, quiet moment. "Ice and fire," he said. 2 words. Jon did not answer them, because they did not require an answer. They were the most accurate 2 words anyone had said to him since Aemon pressed his hand to his cheek in the firelight at Castle Black and told him to go. The fleet moved out of Slaver's Bay in the afternoon, in the gold light of a late southern sun that had the quality of something trying to make itself memorable before it was replaced by different skies. The harbor did not cheer in the way Westerosi crowds cheered. Myrini's custom was quieter, less given to noise as expression. But the docks were full, and the people stood and watched, and the watching had the quality of witnessing. The specific attention of people who understand that they are watching something that will not happen again in their lifetimes, and have decided to look carefully. The 3 dragons lifted from the pyramid's heights as the fleet's lead ships cleared the harbor mouth. Drogon first, black against the afternoon sky. Then Rhaegar, green and bronze, catching the gold light along the leading edges of his wings. Then Viserion, cream and gold, the last one airborne, circling once above the pyramid as if taking a measurement of something before following the others west. Jon took Rhaegar from the flagship's deck. He had 15 rides in him now. 15 had given him what 6 had only suggested, not mastery, which was a longer project, but the beginning of a working relationship. He knew the wing beat rhythm and how to move with it rather than against it. He knew the way Rhaegar communicated a change of direction through the muscles beneath him before it happened. He knew the thermals above the bay and how the dragon sought them. He knew, now, what it felt like to belong in the air. And that knowing had rearranged something in him that he had not known was waiting to be rearranged. They flew above the fleet in loose formation. No maneuvering, no purpose. Simply moving. The fleet stretched below them in the golden afternoon, 100 ships in their convoy with their sails filling on the westward wind. The bay became the open sea, became the horizon that had no end. And in the air above all of it, 2 people on 2 dragons moved, in the specific simplicity of a thing that has been made too complicated for too long, and has found, finally, the uncomplicated version of itself. There was nothing difficult about it in the air. They landed as the sun reached the waterline. Jon came off Rhaegar onto the flagship's stern deck with something approaching technique, smooth enough that Barristan, watching from the rail, did not step forward in the instinctive way he had in the early rides, which Jon had come to recognize as Barristan's version of holding his breath. He stood at the stern as Meereen disappeared. The harbor lights held for a while, small fixed points in the darkening east, and then they were gone, and there was nothing behind them but open water. Barristan came to stand beside him at the rail as the sky went to dark. "Your father would be proud," Barristan said. Jon was quiet for a moment. He was looking west, at the horizon that Westeros was behind, at the wall, which was there somewhere beyond all those miles of water and land, at Winterfell, which had once been the whole of his world, at the dead, who were there also, moving south through the dark beyond the wall in numbers that the living had not yet begun to comprehend. "My father was Ned Stark," Jon said. Barristan said nothing. "He lied to everyone he knew for 17 years to keep me alive. He let his wife hate him for it. He let me think I was a bastard when I wasn't. He did all of that and never asked anything back." Jon's hands were on the rail. "Ned Stark was my father." He let that sit. "But I think Rhaegar Targaryen would have understood what we're doing." Barristan looked at the western horizon for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "He would have." He said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. He left Jon at the stern and went below, and Jon stayed where he was as the last of the light drained from the sky, and the fleet's running lights came up one by one, 100 points of fire moving west through the dark. Later, when the stars were fully out, Daenerys came to the prow. She stood beside him, not behind, not in front. The fleet spread back to the eastern horizon in its running lights, a city that had lifted from the ground and was moving. Above it, 3 dragons circled in the dark, their shapes visible only as shadows passing across the stars. Enormous. Patient. Turning in long, slow arcs above everything they were carrying toward a shore they had not yet reached. Jon looked west. Westeros was there, behind the dark horizon. Winterfell was there, held by a man who had purchased it with Stark blood. The Wall was there, 700 feet of ice exhaling its cold into the northern night, and beyond it, the dead were moving. And the living were there, the lords who remembered, the free folk who had chosen, the people in the villages and the fields and the keeps who did not yet know that something was coming from the east that would change everything they thought they understood about who held power and what power was for. He did not look afraid. Daenerys looked up at the three shadows wheeling above the fleet. "We're going home," she said. Jon considered the horizon. "Which home?" She watched the dragons for a moment, Drogon's black form, Rhaegal's green, Viserion's pale, moving together in the dark above a fleet going west. "Both," she said. The three shadows turned above the fleet, and the fleet moved, and the dark was full of running lights and stars, and the sound of the sea doing what it had always done, which was move in the direction it had decided to move, and take everything on it along. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.